welcome and thank you for joining us today. Today I'm very excited about our program. The topic that we will be focusing in on is grief. And so working through grief. And so today we have with us our guest. Her name is Nancy Bongers. She lives in Platteville, Wisconsin and is a member of the Community Evangelical Free Church in Platteville. And so, Nancy, I want to welcome you onto the show today, and thank you for being here. And I just want to say that Nancy is one of these people that every community needs a Nancy. She's, call her whatever you want, a saint, an angel, but she is so involved in so many ministries in Platteville, and she really makes a difference in our community, and I can't tell you the hundreds, if not thousands, of people that she has helped in one way or another, as a Christian. And so we're going to be talking about grief today, and one of the things that Nancy does is that she leads a grief share program. But before we get into that, I just want to, talk a little bit about your background and some of the other ministries that you are involved with. I mean, I know it gets to be kind of a long list, but if we would just touch on some of them.
Okay. Oh, thanks, Jeff. That's a little overstated. But,
I don't think so.
No.
Okay, well, anyway.
Actually, my background is that I was a school social worker in Platteville for about 31 years. And now I'm retired, and when you retire from school social work or from a social work thing and you've been in the same community for 30 years, things don't go away that were initially part of your job. So some of the things I'm involved in, the Holiday Project in Platteville, which is kind of a major thing in our community, the thrift shop, Salvation Army, we have a local service unit for Grant County, so I'm involved with that. And in my church, it's a Faith in Action ministry team, which is part of where Grief Share comes from. So I've been involved around for a while. My background basically is I have a master's in social work and in counseling, and I was an elementary guidance counselor and school social worker. But what I found for Grief Share, those aren't the right credentials. The credentials are, I've been there and understood loss.
Yeah, so when we think about grief is one of those things that, unfortunately, it's something that we all have to go through sometime in our, well, actually, oftentimes, many times in our life, whether it's the death of a family member, a friend, an acquaintance. And it's really the toughest, kind of the toughest time in life is when we've lost somebody who we love to death. And I know, Nancy, that you unfortunately have had to bear the grief. And see, your husband died, and how many years ago has that been?
Well, it's been 13 years ago.
13 years,
yeah. This summer, so it's been a while, but yeah, and that's, as we talk about grief here, there are so many different kinds of loss. Whether it's someone who's had a long-term illness that you've known, or whether it's a sudden unexpected death. In the case of my husband, had just turned 50 and was very unexpected and very sudden. So those are just different kinds of situations that that people need to deal with. So, and at that time I had a 12-year-old daughter, so that was a whole other thing that made it kind of a unique situation for us. So, but we found I found a lot of things that were helpful at that time for me, and so some of those are things we like to try to pass on to other people that might be grieving and trying to kind of figure out that journey. It is quite a journey.
So it sounds like with your husband, it was a sudden death.
Very sudden, yeah.
And so the shock and the numbness and going through all of the different stages of grief, and then you have other people where, well, they get a terminal illness, or they've been ill, in some cases for years, and how hard that has got to be as well. And so there's, different ways of dying, so there's different ways of grieving, and we all grieve differently. And then, of course, with a 12-year-old daughter, then that even makes the challenge even greater.
Yeah. We've often talked in our grief share groups about, what's better, when it's sudden and you don't see the person suffering, or when it's long term. And the only thing we've decided is that both stink. you know.
Yeah, either
that-
way, it's not an easy thing.
And that there are some positive things and negative things in either direction, you know, depending on
Yeah.
what the circumstances are. But
Sure. I'd like to read a Bible passage here, and then I want just to kind of get your insights a little bit about this, having being a person that works a lot with grief. But it's from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, beginning with the 13th verse. Brothers, we do not want you to be ignorant about those who fall asleep, or to grieve like the rest of men who have no hope. We believe that Jesus died and rose again, and so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him. According to the Lord's own word, we tell you that we who are still alive, who are left till the coming of the Lord, will certainly not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, and the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God. And the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with those in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will be with the Lord forever. Therefore, encourage one another with these words. And what beautiful, powerful words. But one of the things that he says here, right at the beginning, he says, but grieve as though you have hope. And, so oftentimes, Nancy, I've heard, especially Christians, well, society in general will, we try to hide death. We try to deny death. Like, this really isn't part of our reality. But then for Christians, it's not always so helpful when you say, well, we're Christians. Somebody dies, it's a celebration. We are all rejoicing because this person's now in heaven, but yet there's something within us that is hurting. So here even Paul is saying, to encouraging us to grieve. And so that's so much about what you are about in your ministry with Grief Share, isn't it?
Absolutely, because I think sometimes Christians feel guilty that they're hurting so much. And it's not, we can be happy for that person, but there's still a hole in our lives and in our hearts for the person who's gone. And so to be able to acknowledge that and not feel like, you're not showing faith, or you're not being a good example because you're grieving, just isn't true.
So we are to grieve, but to grieve with the hope of our Lord Jesus Christ. And so when I think about breaking a bone, it will take, approximately 6 weeks for that to heal. Now, when somebody dies, our person is broken, and it'd be nice to say to everybody, well, just in 6 weeks it's all going to be better. But that's not the way grief is.
No, and you hear that time heals all wounds, and that really isn't true. It's what you do with that time and during that time that will help with the healing. But yeah, as a society, look what we do. We have 3 days off for bereavement. Well, you can't even plan a funeral hardly in that amount of time. So we really don't, as a society, don't acknowledge that people need time to grieve and time to heal that thing. And sometimes, we've heard there's that magic 1 year, after a year, it ought to be, you ought to be better. And I think what happens is people around the grieving person get uncomfortable because they're still grieving and want back that person that was there before the loss. And so then they feel like a lot of times people feel like they can't really show what they're feeling because other people aren't accepting it, which is one of the nice things about the support group, and that a lot of our members have said, oh, this is a place where people don't mind that we're still talking about it, and that they understand that we, where we're at. You're not better in 6 months. It's like people want us to get over it and get on with things. And I think it's more like the waves of an ocean. It gets better, and you think think that things are going well, and then you turn your back on it, and it really smacks you again. So it comes and goes, and it's not a linear kind of thing. It's things that come up, anniversaries, special days, all those kinds of things, or another loss can bring you right back to that initial point, and you just think, boy, what's happening here?
Yeah, so grief, it's almost like it kind of just hangs around
Yeah.
and kind of ambushes us when we least
Yes,
expect it.
yes.
Like, oh, I'm doing just fine. I think I'm,
Yes.
getting over a lot of things, and which, we are. We're healing.
Yeah.
But then just like that,
Yeah.
something, you'll hear a song or a certain date
See.
will be, or some play,
Yeah.
it just kind of gets you.
Yeah, ambush is a really good thing because it's something that sometimes it just really can sneak up on you. One example that I can think of is, several years after my husband died, there are a lot of gray-haired, chubby guys on Harleys riding around, and you see with the helmet on, and you kind of do a double take, like, whoa, where did that come from? And so there's things like that just happen, and it's especially anniversaries, whether it's birthdays, wedding anniversaries, those kinds of things that are unique to your particular relationship with that person, are ones that and they may linger for years. They don't. What we try and help people know is it won't always hurt this badly. 10 years out. I still knew the anniversary. It happened to be on Father's Day, so it was one of those double kinds of things. But, but it wasn't like 10 years ago, and so you get where part of the grief work is finding a place to put those things. You don't forget the person, but neither do we sort of idolize them and put them on this pedestal. You find a place in your life and in your heart for that relationship, and then you use that in your own life to go on and do things.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's great. Now, one of the, like you mentioned, you have a support group.
Right.
And the support group, it's called Grief Share.
Right.
I mean, that would be the materials
That's
that you
the
use.
materials, right.
And so you have, the support group meets once a week for how many weeks?
For 13 weeks.
For 13 weeks. And how many of these, okay, go ahead.
That's, Grief Share is the curriculum that's
The
used.
curriculum, right.
Part of it is video-based, and there's experts and things on grief that are part of that video. And then there's just people who've had losses that share things. And so together we view the video, but we have a chance then to discuss that. There's information about how to grieve, or things that are helpful in the grieving process. But the real, I think, important part of that is that sharing with each other, and knowing you're not going crazy, that this is a normal thing with grief. There's so many things, even physical things, that were never taught about grief. I mean, I never realized how dehydrated you get. When we're talking about the initial time after someone passes away, you're in a fog for a while. There's just physical stuff. You need to be hydrated. You need, rest and those kinds of things that we just don't know. And people just think they are going crazy. So to come in and find out that, that's normal, I think has been one of the really helpful things for people. But it's not like you get through 13 weeks and then you're done.
Yeah, it's not like you get some kind of a diploma saying, well, I've now...
No, I'm done grieving.
Yeah.
In fact, we have people who've come through the second time or the third time and said, I heard things differently this time because I was at a different place. And have just, one of the ways that they can do, I've had members that use, this is our kind of a workbook that we use to take notes on the videos and things. And they said as they went back through the second time and saw their notes from the first time they went through it, how differently they were, and they could see how much they had grown and how much better they were than when they first started.
So every time, so going through it maybe a second or a third time,
Sure.
The more insights that you get, but then also you are intentional about working through your grief, and so as you go through each time, then you just get a little bit better, or you heal a little bit more every time.
Well, and it depends. We have some people who've come very early. Usually they suggest 6 months after a loss. But I've had people that said, I need it now. And, it might be 2 weeks after they've lost the person. And if it's up to, I leave it up to them. If they come and it's just too fresh and too hurtful, then I say, just come back when we do the next session. But a lot of times people just have come in very early and then gone through it again when they were at a different place but felt like they needed that support at the time. And one of the things is that people who've gone through a couple times are now some of my co-facilitators who do a wonderful job,
Wow, isn't that something? So as far as the curriculum and the class, approximately how many grief shares have you led now?
Well, we've been doing it for about 10 years.
10 years.
And about 2, usually do 2 a year. And occasionally, I usually co-facilitate most of them, not always. There have been a couple times when we have other co-facilitators. In fact, this fall, I'll kind of be the third backup person. But we've been at it for a while.
The fact that you've been able to train up others now
Yes,
to be
yep,
helping you
yeah.
with the ministry.
In fact, the Grief Share curriculum has been redone at least once during the time that we're doing it. So this is the revised version. And we've just, and as many, if you would look at my book, I have a lot of notes in there. But every time I find something different, you know, that I'd missed the first time. So there's just a lot of things in there. One of the other things is this is Through a Season of Grief, and that's a daily devotion that kind of goes along with what we're doing in there.
That would be very helpful, having
yeah,
a daily devotion
yeah.
that focuses on grief.
Yep, and through the website on Grief Share, you also can get that by email. If there's a free daily thing that they send, and again, it comes along with the different chapters that we're dealing with in the group, but it can be totally independent of that as well. So, and one of the things I would like to mention, if people out of this area, there is a website. It's www.griefshare.org, I believe, and there's a Find a Group. And you can go to that website, and they will have there's groups basically all over the country and even internationally. So they could, if somebody's in a different area and would like to be involved, that information is on their website.
Yeah, what a wonderful ministry.
Yeah.
And when we think about ministries, you know, we're called to do ministries, helping people, and all ministries are very important, but grief is unique in that sometimes it's hard to find somebody who you can talk to about grief, just because there's that feeling of being uncomfortable with it. And so to go to a grief share support group, where here are people who say this is a safe place where you can come and that you can just share where you're at, talk about where you're at. But also, as I kind of was thumbing through this book a little bit, that I noticed that this really does kind of guide you through. I mean, yeah, you kind of go there, and I suppose you can talk about what's on your mind for this day, and kind of share your heart. But there's also, every week there is a specific topic that really does pertain to grief. Right. And I don't know if you wanted to share what some of those topics would be.
Yeah. And that's where some of those experts come in. You know, we talk about the uniqueness of grief. Everyone grieves differently, and even though we're the support group, one of the nice things is you say people kind of understand where you're at. You know, they know, but it is so unique depending on what your relationship was with that person. Whether grieving the loss of a child is different than grieving the loss of a spouse or the loss of a parent. Because those relationships are different. The circumstances around the death, we talked about whether it was something that happened very suddenly without any kind of preparation or after a long illness. You know, even there, you may think you're prepared, but then when the actual death comes, you find out you were prepared to be the caregiver. You weren't prepared to lose the person. So there's different kinds of, and then there's complicated grief where circumstances like suicide or murder or, some other particular tragic thing, or if there's a strange relationship going on, there's things that kind of complicate grief, and so we cover all of those kinds of topics during the course of the things. Some of them focus on the loss of a spouse and some of the issues that are particular to that. There's more financial things, there's more, there's just all kinds of other issues. Secondary losses, the things that you don't think about, who mowed the lawn, or who took care of the finances, or who had those different roles that now you have to take on.
It's almost like you're naming all of the death that has happened here. I mean, when this person dies, it's like, well, this is also the death to the guy who mows the lawn, or the death to the one who does the dishes,
or your role as a husband, or your role as a wife.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things that and a lot of those we talked about some of the ambushes things. Those secondary losses are things we don't think about. We've often, with our widows, we've often talked about, I couldn't get the lawnmower started, or I remember being in the car wash and bursting into tears thinking, this is not my job. you know, I didn't have to do this before. So there's those kinds of things. There are parts of the things are dealing with family members or dealing with children and helping them understand grief. Just understanding a little bit about, we talk about stages of grief and how those really aren't quite as cut and dried as, you know, we might have been led to believe.
Yeah,
So,
wasn't it Dr. Kubler-Ross? Wasn't she kind of like the
yeah,
pioneer of this
yeah,
whole
yeah.
grief? You know,
So-
she kind of came up with those different
Stages,
stages of
yeah.
grief, and still that's been very helpful to say, well, you know, these are kind of the different stages, but it's not like you say, well, here we're now in this stage,
Yeah,
now we've
yeah,
graduated to this stage, but it's
yeah.
maybe more of a,
They're much more fluid back and
Yeah.
forth. And her work was with the dying patient. It wasn't so much with the grieving people behind. So there's a lot of different, you know, I mean, there's things that certainly apply.
Oh, sure.
But
Hers is with the
they're a
dying.
little bit different with just understanding, you know, how grief does come and go. And things of just not making decisions right away. And, you know, just some very practical things are some of the weeks. But a lot of, it's a very Bible-based program. And so it's also covering things of how to cope with your grief through relying on the Lord and having those kinds of, you know, that kind of support as well. So, and people do not have to be Christian to come to the group, but we are pretty upfront with letting people know it is a Bible-based program, and that there will be scripture, there will be, you know, things on how God perceives our grief and how He's there to help and support us through that time. So,
Okay, so now you've had obviously a lot of people who have come to the Grief Share support groups, and do you notice as far as healing that happens, or can you give any examples of saying, well, here a person came in, you know, but now going through this program that you actually saw them, you know, heal some from their grief, or what would you say about that?
we can certainly see the progress that people make. I mean, a lot of times, you know, at the very beginning, people are in and just can't share. I mean, they may cry through the whole first group or just aren't ready to really be able to share, but listen, you know, and talk. And like I said, it progresses all the way through where they're now co-facilitating the groups. You know, we're able to see people move. One of the lessons is on how not to get stuck, you know, because there are times when people do get stuck in grief. You know, they just aren't able to move on from things and be able to function in their life. And sometimes people need professional counseling. This is not a counseling group per se, you know, it's a support group. And so if someone needs more help, we try and at least encourage them to see a grief counselor or do something outside of the group as well. But I think especially as people have come through the second time, you know, you can just see they're in a really different place. You know, they're still hurting and there's still things to do, but you can really see where they're functioning better, where, you know, they're not feeling like they're totally crazy, which is the most common thing. I think if there's any thread through all the groups, it's like, I think I've heard that more than any other comment is, oh, I thought I was going crazy. I'm so glad to find out this is normal grief and that it will pass, you know, that it won't always be this hard.
So if you're willing to not fight your grief,
Right.
but to work through your grief in an intentional way, that it does bring you to a place of healing, and that does, versus just saying, well, time will heal
Yeah.
the wound, so to speak.
Well-
But how, you know, because I know when I was, you know, I kind of grew up in a Scandinavian background where, you know, basically, well, you just kind of bite your upper lip and you just bear it, you know. And I also kind of noticed that sometimes men, do you find that men go to this group?
Occasionally,
You know,
we have
you know,
many more
sometimes,
women
you know,
than
men
men.
feel
but-
like, well, I don't want to, you know,
No.
go to grief. You know, it's like, because men grieve too, don't they?
Absolutely.
I mean, it's like we say, well, women grieve and men don't. It's just like, well, you know, don't men also miss their,
In
why?
fact, that's
Go
one
ahead.
of the things that we talk about in one of the videos is how men and women grieve differently, and why a lot of times that creates problems in the relationship, because just because they're grieving differently, they don't believe that the other person is grieving. And so allowing that kind of difference. But I always say you pay now or you pay later. And if you don't deal with the grief now, what you're dealing with is sometimes physical ailments that come, it comes out in one way or another. And I believe God doesn't waste our tears. And that's why being able to do something like this and then go on to, you're more responsive or more able to help others who are grieving. I think another really common thing is people said, I never understood what it meant to go to a visitation or to a wake before. Now I know, we talk about the stupid things that people say sometimes at those situations, but they found that, you don't have to say anything sometimes. Just your presence and just knowing that you're there and that you care. And so those are things that we talk about a lot and share with each other about how to help ourselves and how to help each other.
Yeah, and just a little time that we have, I know that you got a Grief Share support group that's going to be coming up here now in the fall. And why don't you give us the dates, the place, and the times for that in the little time that we have.
Sure. Okay, September 5th, we will be starting the next series of the 13 weeks. It's it's Thursday night from 7 to 9 o'clock at the Community E-Free Church in Platteville. There are 2 group facilitators who are trained and have been through this. I will be kind of the backup person for this one. And it goes 13 weeks, so we're done about December 5th. We don't meet on Thanksgiving. And occasionally if we have bad weather, why we have to postpone it. But we meet 13 consecutive weeks. And we found that helps helps the group to solidify and to really get to know and be comfortable with each other. So we'll be starting that, and if anyone has, any questions about that, they can either call the church office or email me, and we will answer questions.
Yeah, so there is a Grief Share that's coming up, and here again, people come from quite a distance to come to this, and so it's worth the travel. And it's just so wonderful to have a person who is willing and able to help us during a very difficult time as we walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And so, Nancy, thank you so much for joining us today. You've been a real blessing to us.
Well, thanks for having me.
And God bless all of you, and thanks for joining us.